going back to 1970 for a second, is that we can see that if we look at the Capitol Hill area in 1970, there are not large income groups there. But if we go to 1980, there are quite large income groups in the Capitol Hill area. So we're seeing not only the large income groups coming in to Capitol Hill, so there's a change in Capitol Hill, but we also see a change in Southwest. If you look from 1970 to 1980, there's a large influx of high income individuals. This are high income households. These high income households are moving into the Southwest area because in the 1960s, the Southwest area was all the houses, a large number of the houses were removed. About 20, something like 29,000 residents were moved out of the area, and they built the very modernist looking apartment buildings and cooperatives and condos in the area. These the neighborhood shifted dramatically from being a low income area to being a middle class and higher income area. And we can see that by 1980, there are some areas that are quite high income in Southwest. In 1990, it just gets to be more high income in Southwest and also Capitol Hill. By 2000, we see much more movement of higher income people through the Northeast area as well, in addition, though we see pockets of quite low income areas through Anacostia and out on Ward 7, and then up Georgia Avenue as well. The 2006-2010 American Community Survey shows further increases in income in the district with pockets of low income, yet again in the similar areas I just talked about. These low income areas this transitioning of this gentrification that basically replaces lower income areas with higher income, lower income residents with higher income residents, is actually overlaid upon racial changes that happened in the district. The racial changes are basically this it's very interesting. The racial changes absolutely mirror the income changes. So if you look today at, this is the New York Times map of Washington, D.C., D.C. racial segregation, you can see that there is quite a great deal of segregation in D.C. We're known as having a large amount of racial segregation. The blue dots to the right are African Americans, and the green dots to the left are whites. We have pockets of yellow, which are Hispanic, and red, which are Asian. So we can see that we really have a divided city, and we've seen that already with the income maps. It's quite a divided city income-wise. If we look back to 1940, and that's the earliest map I can get for racial division, racial categorization on the map, and we can see here in 1940 that if the brown color are white people, and as it gets lighter, that means more and more African Americans generally are in that area. So you can see that African Americans in 1940 are located primarily in Southeast, Southwest, and Northeast. And white people are congregated primarily in the suburbs all around and throughout Arlington, and then in Northwest and upper North, the northern part of the city, and upper Northeast. So those darker colors are white people, and the lighter colors are African Americans. We know that actually well before 1940, the map had actually dramatically changed in Washington, D.C. and other places. In 1940, around 1890, a sociologist talks about this, Keith Gotham. He talks about how in Kansas City, in 1990, whites and blacks are distributed rather evenly through Kansas City. This makes some sense because at the time, African Americans were often working for white people and thus lived very close by white people. This was an even distribution at the time, but we see starting in 1900 in many cities across the United States, a shifting of an increasing racial segregation occurring, which just intensifies through 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. This segregation is caused by the fact that real estate agents and real estate lobbyists are very interested in connecting, in the minds of white people, connecting property values and race. They want to convince white people that their property values depend on them living in a white part of town. If African Americans come into that part of town, they are told that their property values will decrease. This means that if white people can maintain a white neighborhood, they believe, and often it was true, they could have higher property values and sell their house for more. This had another effect as well. It meant that so white people became very highly invested in racially white neighborhoods, living in those neighborhoods. At the same time, African Americans, because there were these large amounts of areas, which you can see on this map, that were closed to them, and I'll tell you how they were closed to them in a second, the African Americans were thus restricted to very specific parts of town. By restricting African Americans to certain parts of town, those involved with real estate could charge African Americans quite a great deal of money because there was very little supply for African Americans, very little housing supply for African Americans. So African Americans ended up paying quite a lot of money to either rent or buy housing. The reason that white people could maintain racially pure neighborhoods is because in the early 1900s, real estate agents encouraged white property owners to put racially restrictive covenants in their housing deeds. What these covenants did is that it made it informally and sometimes formally illegal for those people to sell their house to African Americans. Also, it was often illegal to sell the house to Jews or to other groups. These covenants existed in different parts of DC. People will talk about, finding a covenant on their house title. But what's very important in DC, and you can see in the dark part in the 1940 map that we're looking at, the area to the upper northeast, upper north, and upper northwest, those areas were new developments created by real estate developers of houses, and those houses had racially restricted covenants on them so that no African American was allowed to buy into those areas. And that's why we see an incredible white concentration in these areas. These covenants are sometimes allowed to be enforced by the police. I've read about cases of these covenants being enforced by mobs in DC. So in the case of there was a case around Bloomingdale somewhere where someone had sold a house, a white person had sold a house to what that person claimed was another white person. But then someone had decided that person was not white, but in fact was African American. A mob of about 500 people came over to that house and demanded that the supposed white person who had bought the house should return the house to the original owner, and that the original white owner should not be allowed to sell to an African American. This is through this kind of coercion, white people were able to keep neighborhoods white and thus keeping out African Americans. This connection between real estate values and race exists still today. People talk about this, about wanting to be in certain neighborhoods and not others for real estate value. So, of course, African Americans may not speak in this way. It's white people that would speak in this way. So we can see in 1940, the large concentration of white people on the map, very dark color brown, is likely caused by a large amount of racially restricted covenants. We're going to see by 1950 some change in this. It's still somewhat similar, but we're going to see a change coming in the next decades. I couldn't get, in this 1950 map, I couldn't get the counties in because the census data didn't have the counties with this particular map. But in 1948, it became illegal for people to have racially restricted covenants on their houses. It was the Supreme Court had declared it illegal, and therefore it was no longer allowed. Now, of course, it can be allowed, continued by informal means, but it was no longer could be held up in court. So in 1950 we see the map, but if we go to 1960, we see a lightening of areas along the upper northeast and upper northern areas of DC. West of the park is still quite dark, full of concentrated white people. And we can see that there are quite a few African Americans in the southwest area. And we can see that Anacostia has pockets of white people and pockets of African American people. So if we look from 1960 to 1970, we can see that Anacostia and Ward 7 changed quite considerably. We still see in the western part of the city and into the suburbs quite a huge concentration of white people. The city is very much a divided city. The city is both divided by race, but also by income as well. We can see in 1980 a continuing division in the city, and changes through the city to the east is quite African American, and to the west is quite white. Interestingly, though, we see, as we saw in Capitol Hill area through the 1970 to 1980 and increasing incomes in Capitol Hill, we also see in 1970 and 1980 increasing white people on Capitol Hill. We can see there's quite a large concentration there, right, to the west, to the east of the mall. And if we go to 1990, we still see expanding amounts of white people. The area also is quite white in Southwest, which we talked about before. That's the area that was redeveloped. There's an area in the Anacostia area. There's a area that's outlined in blue. Those areas outlined in blue are military forts. So those are military areas and are very different demographics than the rest of the city. So we go to 2000, we can see more intensity of white people around Capitol Hill and to the west of the city. And we see in 2010 more white people moving into the downtown part of the city and up the North Capitol area and into the area to the north. So it's not only, we see a sort of spreading from the downtown outwards.